The Jets were very active in free agency. Should that impact the way they operate in the NFL draft? I say no, and I'll explain why today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, March 21st, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangreneNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Today we have our mailbag show. Normally we do our mailbags on Wednesday, but because of free agency, we've had to miss the last couple of Wednesdays. So decided to open up the floor to listener questions today and do a mailbag a day later than we typically do. Thanks so much to everybody who sent in questions. Let's begin. Our first question. John, I thought the Jets really added quality players this free agency. Well, I never give the Jets the benefit of the doubt. They seem to have filled most of their holes prior to the draft. How should the Jets approach the draft now? And that's a great question. And I agree. The Jets obviously were very active in free agency this year, as expected. And despite that activity, I don't know that the Jets draft plans should change all that much. I think entering the draft, most people thought they were probably going to focus on either wide receiver or tackle. Now, the moves that they've made in free agency have added some degree of flexibility from the standpoint that now they're not desperate at either position. If worse comes to worse and, there's a run on the good tackles early and there's a run on the good wide receivers early, it's not the end of the world in the short run. You can feel okay going into 2024 with what you got at tackle and what you got at receiver. And that's one of the keys. You never want to go into the NFL draft desperate to draft a player at a position. That's the spot the Jets were in 2020 when they picked Mekhi Becton. Now, of course, they probably, in hindsight, they should have picked Tristan Wirfs. But part of the reason they made that mistake was they were desperate. They needed a tackle. They could not go into the 2020 season without a tackle. So they had to roll the dice on Mekhi Becton over, say, I don't know, CeeDee Lamb. You never want to be desperate. And now the Jets will not enter the NFL draft desperate. Still, with that said, I think that the focus should remain, if all things are equal, either wide receiver or tackle. I say that for a couple of reasons. Now, there's the short-term perspective. Look, Jets have added some guys who are very sensible rolls of the dice, but they still remain rolls of the dice. When you're talking Tyron Smith, you're hoping he stays healthy. When you're talking Morgan Moses, he's 33, he's still playing at a high level. He's shown durability, but even then, he missed games last year for the first time since his rookie season. Even though he's very durable and been that way through his career, I think it's fair to say, 33, actually missed some time last year, maybe not a lot, but still missed some time. 33 is a point where, for a lot of offensive linemen, the body starts breaking down. And then you have Mike Williams, who they brought in. Again, I think a sensible gamble for where the Jets were, but guy who's turning 30, guy who's coming off a serious injury. So these guys are not sure things. So in the short-term perspective, you might want to add a tackle or a wide receiver just for a little insurance, because if one of those three guys goes down, and these are like the three guys the offseason built on, the other guys like Kinlaw, whatever, they're the rest of the guys the Jets have signed are not really significant additions. If one of those three guys goes down, you're kind of back to where you were in 2023, at the position they play. You're in trouble at one of either of the tackle spots if Moses or Smith goes down. You're in trouble at wide receiver if Williams goes down. Now we're back to the days of, depending on Lazard and Brownlee and Gibson to back up, to be Garrett Wilson's supporting cast. That's not good enough. The second, though, and bigger reason why I don't think the plan should change is that if you look in the long run at these positions, the outlook's not that different from where it was at the start of the offseason. These were short-term additions. These are the types of moves that can get you through 2024 and hopefully, maybe even 2025 if you re-sign these guys. But these are not guys who are going to be here 2-3 years down the line. And you need to build an infrastructure. You need to build a core that goes into the long run. And that's part of the reason, look, I think Joe Douglas, for the options that were in front of him this offseason, did perfectly fine. I'm still a big Joe Douglas skeptic when we're talking about whether he's the right long-term fit for the Jets, because I look at a lot of positions and yeah, maybe they're okay for this year, but the Jets have an awful lot of work to do for the future. And 5 years in, I mean, I don't know that the Jets should need to have taken as many, gambles on veteran guys coming off injuries as they did this offseason. It's kind of like you look at it two different ways. For the position the Jets were in, the guys that they signed were probably about as well as they could do. But I think you also ask, why were we in this position where we were so desperate at tackle and so desperate at wide receiver entering the offseason that we had to take all these gambles? And that's because Douglas hasn't done that great of a job. So I think that if we're talking about the long run, and look, there are short-term implications here. If you're only focused on 2024, you'd like to have a little bit more insurance at both of these positions. But in the long run, if you're talking about wide receiver 2 years down the line, how many players currently on the roster are still going to be on the Jets team? Probably Garrett Wilson. 2 years down the line, if you're looking at the offensive line, how many of these guys are still going to be on the team? Well, Joe Tippmann's one. Maybe Elijah Vera Tucker. I have optimism about AVT. After that, not a whole, I can't think of anybody. And that's true at the tackle position, which is the toughest spot on the offensive line to fill. So the Jets need to build up these spots. These are two spots the Jets really need to build up. Now, the good thing is that you can have some flexibility. The good thing is now it's not the end of the world. Let's say, and this is one of those things where you always have to read the situation in front of you. It might just be a situation where, what, it just doesn't make sense. Even though these are spots where we need help, the value is just not there. And if that's the case, now you're at least not sinking yourself in 2024. And that I think is where the real value of these signings comes in. Our next question, should the Jets look to trade down from 10? Absolutely. I thought this before all the free agent signings. I think now it's an easier sell to the fan base and the media. Like, I think that the biggest issue Douglas would have had if he tried to trade down from 10 before the signings is there'd be the perception, oh, my goodness, you're blowing your chance at getting a plug-and-play guy at a position of critical need. Now these positions are no longer in as dire of a state, so I think it's an easier sell to the media and the fan base. And while I don't think that should be a factor, I think it always is a factor for teams. But if you look historically through the NFL, I've done the math. If you look at the most logical trade partner for the Jets, and I don't know whether this team would actually want to trade up, and that's obviously a key component here. But the most logical trade partner for the Jets, if this team wanted to move up, would be Cincinnati, because Cincinnati's first round pick and second round pick, if you look at the points chart, they add up to almost perfectly with the 10th overall pick. So it'd be a very clean trade where if the Bengals sent their first round pick at 18 and their second round pick to the Jets, the points match up perfectly with the 10th overall pick. So the Jets would be able to add a second round pick. But if you look historically, and I looked at this going back to the year 2000, I looked at the results of your typical 10th overall pick and your typical 18th overall pick, virtually identical when we're talking about starts, when we're talking about Pro Bowls made, number of Pro Bowl appearances, number of players who made the Pro Bowl from those selections. There's not a big difference between the 10th overall pick and the 18th overall pick. And I think that the perceptions that you're really damaging your odds of finding a good player if you trade down 8 slots in the first round, when in reality, you're not really hurting yourself that much. The draft's a very inexact science. And, this is part of the whole tanking debate during the season where people are like, oh my goodness, the Jets ruined everything by winning those games late in the year. Look, if you can't find a great player at 10, you're doing it wrong. And I'll say this, if you can't find a great player in the late teens at like 18, you're doing it wrong. It's more an issue of the GM you have than the pick you're making. And look, would I rather have if you offered me, would you rather have the 10th overall pick or the 18th overall pick? Of course, I'm going to pick the 10th pick. But when you factor in maybe getting a second round pick along with the 18, if you're 18 and the second round pick are a package, I'm going to take 18 and the second round pick over 10. So I think there's no question about it. And it goes back to what I said. Too many areas where the Jets really have long-term needs, where maybe they're fine this year, but if you look past 2024, they've got to add some young talent. And the best way to do that is adding extra picks in the early rounds. And the rounds you should really be looking to add, the rounds where a lot of good franchises focus are rounds 2 through 4. So if you can add extra picks in the second through fourth rounds, by all means do it. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about the offseason the Jets have had. Joe Douglas getting rave reviews for his performance so far. How's he been different this year than the years past? We'll discuss that today as we continue this Thursday edition of the Locked On Jets mailbag. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a one seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. Yeah, I know. The first round of the NCAA tournament gets underway today, and I know you think you have the perfect bracket. Talk to me in a couple days. You're going to be upset because your bracket's going to be busted. Well, that's where FanDuel comes in, because even if your bracket's busted, again, you can bet on every game of the tourney. So it doesn't matter if your Final Four all goes down in the first round. Just head to FanDuel. It's FanDuel.com/lockedon. You can bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Again, it's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel.com/LOCKEDON. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. A big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and then bonus episodes as needed. We continue now with this special Thursday mailbag show. Our next question, John, you've said in the last 5 to 6 days, you've finally seen some good general managing from Joe Douglas. Do you think JD has changed his approach, or that players might be seeing the Jets as a more attractive destination this season? Every year we hear JD was in on top free agents, even offered the same money or even more to get them. This year we are in on these guys with headline numbers that sound impressive, but deals that are actually quite team friendly. If it's true that the difference is just the players see the Jets, is it true that the difference is just the players see the Jets as more attractive? I think that there's probably something to that. Look, I think having Rodgers as your quarterback certainly helps out. It makes it a little bit easier when Rodgers is the quarterback. You have to remember last year, the Jets struck out on 1 million free agents, but there was like that whole issue of the trade that dragged on forever. The Jets took forever to complete it with the negotiations. Last offseason was a mess in many ways. And part of it was, even though like you knew Rodgers was probably coming, there was just so many, it just put a cloud on everything, because first of all, the deal wasn't done. But second of all, the Jets had not figured out the Rodgers contract. So I think part of it was they didn't know how much money they had. This year Rodgers is in place, and I think that it makes it much easier to recruit players. And fortunately, Rodgers kind of stayed away. And one of my concerns this year was the Jets were going to go out and sign more Rodgers friends, and fortunately, that has not happened. So that's a positive. But I think it is an easier sell when Rodgers is here. And I think if we're talking about what's changed, that would be number one. But look, I also want to give Douglas credit, because he's going after a higher caliber free agent this year than he has in the past. I think that in the past he's always been looking for. Kinlaw is actually a perfect example of a guy Douglas usually signs, and that signing looks a little shaky. If we're talking about what the Jets did well in free agency, I mean, it's really three guys. They're really three signings. We don't need to praise the entirety of Jets free agency, because letting Huff go, I think, was a mistake. Signing Kinlaw was a mistake, but usually they're going for the Kinlaw type guys, the guy who was like the first or second round draft pick, the guy with the rare athletic tools, the guy who's been an underperformer. And the Jets are saying, we're going to unlock this guy. We're going to figure it out. And they almost never do. You could say that with Brashad Perryman. You could say that with Jared Davis. To an extent, you could say it with Corey Davis. George Fant was not an early round pick, but he was a guy who viewed as kind of an elite athlete. Mecole Hardman last year. Jets always do this. Instead, they've gone after guys with proven high-end track records, guys who are maybe coming off injuries, guys who are a little bit older, but guys who, if they perform well, really move the needle for your team. I think Douglas at times tries to be the smartest guy in the room. I think he tries to show you, like, I'm smarter than everybody. I can find talent where nobody else can, and that's why you get these guys. And they've done it over and over in free agency. Now, as we all know, the playing at the top of the free agency is almost always a fool's errand. It's a mistake that always gets made. The teams that give out the huge contracts, they almost never succeed in free agency. You have to find the value deals, and there are different ways to find the value deals. But one of the ways the Jets have gone after it this year is they're finding guys who are really still high-end players who, maybe there's a reason their value's fallen out. Maybe it's age, maybe it's they're coming off an injury, maybe it's both. And they're, bringing them in on deals that seem reasonable. And, I go back to something I said yesterday. It's not that all these moves are going to work out, but if one or two of them work out, it really changes where this franchise can move. And of course, if all three of them work out, then Jets are a legitimate Super Bowl contender. And one of the things that's annoying with Douglas is the excuses people make for him, where it's like, oh, how can he recruit free agents? The Jets have been such a bad franchise for so long. Well, Douglas has been here since 2019. That was an excuse his first or second year. He's been here long enough to turn that around. So that's not a good excuse. People say, oh, the taxes, oh, the weather, oh, the turf. You know what? Every team has disadvantages and advantages and disadvantages. I mean, it amazes me that like people act like, yeah, and look, those things are real. I'm not saying that those things don't exist. I'm not saying those things are irrelevant, but people act like New York's not an attractive place to live for a wealthy NFL player. It's a very attractive place to live. There's a lot that New York has to offer. And we act like that nobody would ever want to come here. I think that it's showing how flimsy a lot of the excuses made for Douglas was above all else. But so I think it's look, I do give Douglas credit. I do think Rodgers being here has made the Jets a more attractive destination for free agents. But I think the approach has also changed. I think there's part of it's just that the approach has been better this year, where we're not trying. I can't say we're not trying completely because we still brought in Kinlaw, but we're going for higher end guys who are maybe like the value is not as high as it should be on these guys. We're trying to find some guys who are really game changing type talents, and they can these guys can maybe come at a discount because of some of the flaws, but if they succeed, they'll really move the needle for the Jets. Our next question, John. After all these additions, what's your biggest concern about this team? It's depth. I don't think the Jets have very good depth. I struggle to find the positions where I think the Jets have good depth right now. I mean, the defensive end is a spot where you can make a case but that depends on Will McDonald's having a breakout season. Corner, they do have Brandon Eccles, who can play both inside and outside, who has got plenty of starting experience, but Eccles is not that great. And I think that when we're talking about depth, it kind of goes hand in hand with the guys that Jets brought in, because these guys are risky. Tyron Smith's risky. Mike Williams, maybe not as risky as people are making him out to be, but still coming off an injury. Morgan Moses, he's been solid, but he's in his mid-30s. And we've seen the way injuries have decimated the offensive line the last couple of years. You've got Tyron Smith, you've got AVT, both of whom are pretty big injury risks. And the Jets' offensive line, the backups are not very good, and that goes back to what I was talking about in the draft: the need to find some premium young talent, not just to help the team's talent base in the long run, but also just to improve the depth right now. And look, it's good that we're talking about depth. I don't know that there's necessarily a glaring hole on this roster anymore. That's a positive thing. I mean, that's certainly a contrast from what we're usually talking about this time of year on the show. So, Jets have built their team up well, but the guys they brought in are all kind of risky players, and it's like the Jets are going to be depending on a lot of older players, a lot of injury prone players, probably more than your typical team, and they don't have very good depth right now. So I think if anything could derail the season right now, the lack of depth across the roster kind of stands out, and something they're going to have to look to address. There's still some time in free agencies to get some guys, but a lot of your depth comes through hitting on like mid-round picks and late-round picks. Jets have not been good at that, and that's part of the reason the depth's not that good. Douglas has got to get better there. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk a little bit more about depth, particularly at the tackle position. Still a couple of players available who could come on reasonable deals. I'll give you my thoughts on some of the options as we continue this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. The show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you do if you had an extra hour in your day? Would you go for a run, take a nap, read a book, show up for a friend? A lot of us spend our lives wishing we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and to make it a priority. Therapy can help find what matters to you so you can do more of it. Therapy has so many benefits. It's helpful for learning positive coping skills and how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself, and it's not just for those who've experienced major trauma. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. We're doing a mailbag show here on this Thursday. Our next question, John, how do you respond if the Jets sign David Bakhtiari to a $2 million deal as depth? I don't think it makes sense. I mean, as little sense as Bakhtiari made when we're talking about him being a starter, I think him being a backup right now makes as little sense. I mean, look, you got Tyron Smith as a major injury risk. You need a backup tackle who can stay healthy, who can be durable. You need somebody who can stay in the lineup. Bakhtiari's body's falling apart. I mean, look, I'm not even sure Bakhtiari's going to be able to play this year. I mean, he failed his physical when the Packers released him. I mean, I think it's a long road to think Bakhtiari can stay healthy. Now, look, if they get him for a cheap deal, it's not the end of the world. It's certainly not. I'm certainly not going to be as upset as I would have been if they brought him in to be a starter and thought he could hold up over the course of 17 games. If they want to do that, I guess it's fine. But I don't know if this guy can play anymore. And I certainly don't think that the Jets are set on depth if they get Bakhtiari, because with two guys in their mid-30s as their starters, you need somebody you can count on to stay healthy, someone you can count on to stay on the field if either Tyron Smith or Morgan Moses goes down. So, look, I guess it's $2 million, am I going to go nuts? No. Am I going to think it really helps anything? Not really. I mean, I guess you could make the case that if you needed him for a game or two, maybe you could do that, but I don't know. I mean, what if Tyron Smith, needs to miss a month? Will Bakhtiari be able to stay on the field? Yeah, I kind of doubt it. Our next question, John, I noticed that Mekhi Becton remains unsigned as of the time you're recording this podcast. One sports network I follow labeled him a quote-unquote starting caliber tackle, which I could not help but chuckle at as a longtime listener of yours. Do you believe the Jets should bring back Becton on a cheap deal as a backup, or are they better off at this point trying to simply find better depth elsewhere? Yeah, I'd look elsewhere. We talk about Zach Wilson all the time needing a change of scenery. How, if it's ever going to work for Zach, maybe it's just better for him to get away from New York, get away from all the negativity of the fan base and the media, and just start fresh, have a chance to begin his career anew. And I think a lot of that applies to Becton. This has just been a bad place for Becton. He did not get along with the coaching. It's clear he did not get along with the coaching staff. I mean, essentially, it was 3 years of Becton and the coaching staff sniping at each other in the media. These guys, there were issues from like the very start with Becton, with Saleh. And it's easy to forget, Becton was drafted to be the left tackle when Gase was here. So Becton was not Saleh's pick. And it's just like they went back at each other. Becton was critical of them for the way they handled his injury in 2022. I mean, Saleh and the coaching staff, they seem to have a lot to say about Becton. And so I think it's best that everybody just moves on. Beyond that, I mean, I'm not very high on Becton's ability to continue his career successfully. I just don't know what there is that makes me think that Becton's going to be a good player in this league. He had that rookie season where he looked pretty good, but since then we've had 2 missed seasons, so you can't count on him to stay on the field. And he had a season this year where he wasn't very good. You could say, well, the injury impacted him this year, and maybe that's true. Look, 2 back-to-back knee injuries, those can change the trajectory of the career. But that's a problem. The knee injury is not going away. I mean, the only way I think you could thread the needle and say Becton, has a shot is if you just say, he was rusty this year. Maybe with an extra year for the knee to heal, he'll be better next year. But I just don't find that very convincing. I mean, it's not like Becton showed signs. It's not like, if you want to think of Becton got better as the season went on, if anything, he got worse as the season went on. So, if he started playing really good football in November, December, January, I think you could say, maybe he started to heal as the season progressed. Maybe now this is the real Becton, but it didn't. He was awful as the season came to its conclusion. I mean, I think halfway through the year, there was a case to be made that maybe the Jets were going to re-sign Becton. He just kind of played himself off the team. And the guy I saw out there late in the season, I don't even know if he can help you as a backup. I know you could say, well, he had the talent to be drafted 11th overall, but I don't know. I mean, that was a different player. That was 2 knee injuries ago. That was, a really bad season ago. I think, a lot of times teams pick up these former high first round picks as reclamation projects, so they think they're going to fix them. How often does it actually work? It's easy to rationalize a signing, and this is, going back to my criticism of Douglas. It's easy to say, well, this guy must have talent. He was a first-round pick. Yeah, but if he hasn't shown it in 4 years in the league, what are the odds he's going to show it going forward? Probably not very high. So, look, if they brought Becton back on a 1-year contract, that's fine. But I'll say the same thing I said about Bakhtiari. I don't think this can be Plan A. I don't think this could be your number 1 backup. I don't think this is the guy you lean on if anything happens to Tyron Smith or Morgan Moses. I think there has to be another plan. And, probably what I'm talking about would mean drafting somebody in the top 10. If the Jets draft somebody in the top 10, by the way, I keep seeing people say, well, you don't draft the top 10 pick to sit, so you can't draft a tackle now. Like if the Jets draft a tackle in the top 10, that guy can start. Let's not act like Morgan Moses is so good that he can't sit for a top 10 tackle and Moses becomes the backup, because that was the situation the Jets were in 2021. When Moses was the starting right tackle in 2021 and played well, he began the season as the backup, and Becton got injured, and that's how Moses got into the starting lineup. So, if we're talking about improving the depth of tackle, and look, it depends on who's available, it depends on who's on the board when the Jets pick, but I think we're talking about using that 10th pick. I think that's the move we're talking about. And our last question, John, do you feel Brock Bowers will reach the heights that Ryan Griffin reached in the NFL? Well, those are very lofty goals. That's a very lofty goal. I'm sorry, I ended the show on a terrible joke. That actually was a question we got. Somebody asked if Brock Bowers will attain the heights Ryan Griffin reached in the NFL. So that was a real question, but we'll end it with a terrible joke and say, oh, I certainly hope so, but it's going to be really tough. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week.